Hello and welcome to Talking Events, the industry podcast brought to you by Event Industry News. At a time of year where our industry is about to hit the road and set off for the next few months around the UK and around continental Europe as the summer event season ramps up, today's episode is being recorded back at HQ, back at the home of Event Industry News in our own offices. And we're going to be talking about what's being labelled as the biggest political decision we've got to make for a generation. On June the 23rd, UK voters will go to the polls to decide whether or not they want to stay in or out of the EU. What could that mean for our industry? How will it affect the industry? How will it affect people working within the industry? Will it be good? Will it be bad? Do we just don't know? Let's welcome today's guests and get talking. Nick Howden joins us on the line today. Nick, welcome back to Talking Events.
Hi there.
Robin Carlisle from Mobile Promotions. Again, a big welcome back to Talking Events. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Good morning.
Chaps, all sorts of coverage in the media at the moment about Brexit, what it could mean for us as individuals, as general consumers, and as voters. But when we're looking specifically at the event industry, inevitably it will have an impact. But let's start by saying, how does it affect people as we stand at the moment? Robin, I know a lot of your work is done out on the road and working, and you've got a lot of experience working in Europe. How does it affect you at the moment by being in the EU?
It's made life from way back when we were not in the EU. I'm senior enough to remember those days. It's made life so much easier. Being able to travel cross-border without things called ATA carnets, which are very unwieldy pieces of documentation that listed every nut and bolt that you carried in a truck or trucks to and from events. For us who have our own logistics business in addition to our event management skills, it was, to use that well-worn word, it was a nightmare very often. And hold-ups at borders while customs guys were sort of stamping pieces of paper willy-nilly was really the traditional nightmare. And in fact, I can remember getting caught between borders with a couple of colleagues on a truck, and we just lost a couple of days whilst somebody was waiting to stamp the right piece of paper. I just sort of bring that up to date. As far as I'm concerned, I have been one of those that's been in doubt over the coming vote on in or out, but I think I'm now, from what I've read and what I've considered, 100% we have to stay in. There are other reasons which we'll come to, I'm sure, but 100% we need to be able to get across Europe with ease and as part of it.
Nick, I think Robin there speaking as a company professionally that does an awful lot of work in Europe. Does the whole of the UK events industry have to focus on what it could mean for them in Europe, or is it only a small minority of the actual suppliers and the people that work in the event industry in the UK that are actually affected by whether or not they can get around Europe easily?
I think there's, as Robin alluded to, there's more to it than that, obviously. But if there'll be some people who have a lot of work in Europe and will just be, as much as anything else, a real pain just trying to. You can imagine, can't you, the way people are. If you decide to come out, more little barriers will come up almost instinctively, and which I could absolutely appreciate. To say, look, you've made this decision. We'll make your life more difficult because you've been a pain, and the whole thing begins to unravel, which is another whole conversation. And I can imagine there'll be a few more little tripwires put up there to say, if you hadn't done this, your life would have been so much easier. So I think big business, small business, anybody who's, their life would be made a lot more difficult, I think, very quickly, and particularly in the short term with Brexit. So I would see it like that for companies big and small.
Robin, would you go along with what Nick said there, that essentially there could be a little bit of bad blood there, and in the short term, people, just to make things that little bit more difficult, may just sort of put a few extra hurdles in our way if we do vote out?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a great believer now in you have to be in it to win it, and if we're not in Europe, we're not going to be able to influence decisions that influence us as a nation, whether it's influencing our private lives, our leisure lives, our travel lives, our holiday lives, and indeed our work lives. I think, I'm now firmly in it. There's no question.
When it comes to things like, we hear this term European directives, all sorts of European directives, but particularly when we were looking ahead at today's episode, working time directives. How did being in Europe affect our working time directives, and particularly looking at things like the time that can be spent driving a vehicle and moving stuff around? Is there any benefit at all to being out where we may be able to relook at some of those working hours directives at all that were set by Europe that we could rethink that are in fact a little bit more sensible for how we know we can operate?
I tend to feel that I don't want to get political here, but I do think the current government and the current leadership is doing a pretty decent job of negotiating with Europe from being part of it. We don't follow all the European directives that are issued. We're still allowed curved bananas, for instance, despite what was spoken about in the press a while ago. I know that's a flippant use of some of what's happened, but no, we've seen it in other ways, whether it's parental time off, whether it's to do with driving issues. I think we should all logistics, you asked me about driving particularly. I think we should all welcome cross-European legislation, because our borders are open and the ferries and the tunnels are bringing foreign trucks to our shores, and we should have the same control over them that they have over us, and very often that doesn't seem to be the case.
A lot of the public campaigns, it both in and out, in or out, so far have focused on what you may term as fear tactics. It is looking at some of the negative things that could happen and may happen should we either stay in or stay out. Robin, the first question I posed to you was refreshing in a way that you highlighted what were clear benefits to you as an operation of being in Europe. What other benefits does it have to business? I mean, from a financial point of view, when you are dealing with continental clients and working with accounts and invoicing and banking, are there clear benefits to that side of the business as well, not just from the logistical side of getting people in and around Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people would say we should adopt the euro. I'm one of those that would prefer to stay in it and be in it to help forge this winning position for our economy as a whole, and certainly the events industry. But I would like to hang on to sterling. I think that does give us an edge very often. I know it can fluctuate, and I know therefore we have issues that as business people we need to balance on invoicing, or if we're going on holiday or whatever it might be. But again, I just see that as giving us an edge. There are other factors, for instance, health and safety documentation and the TUV and DIN regulations across Europe very often are not accepted in the UK. And that does make it difficult when we're working with clients who bring equipment from agencies that we work with in the UK. I mean, to be honest, it actually creates work for us, which is good, because we can do translations and we can translate both language, but also regulation, from those two, DIN and TUV, into whatever it is that the locations we're working with are asking for. So, I think that's good for us as all in the event industry, that we're here advising and consulting as well as doing.
Nick, I'm curious to see if you've got any got an opinion on what I'm going to ask you here, and I'm looking at some information that suggested that smaller acts who rely on touring Europe, when we're looking specifically at the music business and European festivals and European music events, that smaller acts could be greatly affected because of the cost that it's going to incur to them of moving even a small amount of personnel in and around countries because of visas and having to pay for visas, Schengen visa costs, etc. Putting potentially £300-400 as a minimum, even for a small group of people, just to get in and around countries. Have you got any experience of having dealt with the touring side of the music industry and just how tight those budgets are and potentially what the impact is on those?
Not in that respect, but Canada, and I'm not sure if I'm right in saying North America, but certainly in Canada, there was a charge put on touring acts, and you coming from outside or from Europe. I remember there was big chat about it as a sort of what was considered a fairly punitive fee, particularly for smaller acts who weren't going to get that kind of significant enough return to write it off. But anything that's when you just look at it, it's a sea of unknowns, isn't it? And if you look at the two arguments, there's the in campaign, at least, and regardless of your politics, at least there's some sense of what's come before and an accurate prediction. It's just total, weird. For Brexit, all they can do is guess. It's absolute. It sounds like paranoid guesswork to me, by and large. Of this is going to happen. We're going to be umpteen million Turks coming into the. It's all years, decades away anyway, and gross exaggeration. It's like the Daily Mail waving around and everyone standing underneath it saying you're right with these paranoid headlines. And if you're looking at a touring ban and you can reduce it to that kind of scale to make their lives more difficult when you've already got venues in this country shutting down, the smaller ones, the nascent ones, the ones that you need to fuel that. The music business, which is vital, which is a huge part of the event industry in this country, to make it any more difficult anywhere is completely stupid, actually. And I do think that you've got to have at least an argument based on facts, not theory, and not on a housewife's favourite, which is the other flag they're waving is Boris Johnson, who would have been equally in or out depending on what Cameron had done. So the whole thing is built on sand on the Brexit side. And I just hope there's not this kind of people wanting to do the opposite to what the government's saying because they don't like the government or whatever.
Just out of spite.
Yeah, you've got to look at the realities, and there's a ramping up, and there's of the inside saying things that they don't, they can't quite see around the corner, but at least they've got a torch on and can see some of it. Whereas Brexit is absolute guesswork, and that we're not at a time economically or in any other way where we can afford to take a quantum guess like that. And I think it would batter us for 10 years. I'm not saying that down the track it may not come right, but for 10 years the stock market would crash. Everything would be more difficult and more expensive. The only redeeming feature I can actually see for anybody is the theory that the house prices might get cheaper. I think that's something that could, you'd almost see people saying, "God, brilliant! House prices might get cheaper." So, but I haven't heard anything otherwise, and that was from the in-campaign saying if we go out, house prices might drop on the basis that a lot of Conservative voters are property owners, and so that was playing to that. But actually, there's a hell of a lot of people who want to get on the ladder, and that's probably the only thing I could see as being one of the benefits. But then you'd have less money, higher interest rates, and you wouldn't be able to pay for it anyway. So it doesn't make any sense.
We were quite keen to talk about this, not so much because it's a hot topic and let's jump on the bandwagon and talk Brexit on Talking Events, but most of the media coverage that we have been subjected to on a day-to-day basis is very much focused on how it affects us perhaps individually as people on a day-to-day level, just simply living in this country. I've not heard a huge amount of discussion as to how it would actually affect any given trade industry as such, and that's why we were keen to talk about it on today's event, to look specifically at how it does affect the event industry and whether or not people working in that industry should be taking more of into account of how it will affect them from a day-to-day point of view. Robin, has there been much discussion at your end? You've obviously looked into it in depth, just based on your answers and the responses that you've given so far, but have you had a lot of discussion with other people working in the event industry as to whether or not this is a good or a bad thing?
Not extensively, no. Chat down the pub. I was surprised at a reaction I had chatting to our own team here, because I'm actually going to be working on an event with a number of them. We won't be able to get to the polling station, so I've done the postal event thing, and I did say to the team here, some 30 plus people, who else is away and who wants this information on the postal vote, and most of them leapt at it. I was actually quite surprised, and I have to say most of them not being influenced at all by us. It's obviously a free vote, but they all seem to be very keen to have the same, you've got to be in it to win it attitude, really.
But these are obviously the staff who, as you point out, are on the road, presumably a lot of them, and actually seeing firsthand the impact that it could have if they weren't able to travel as freely.
Yeah, and I think they've got a sense of they work and it will affect the country economically. And as Nick says, nobody really knows. This has not happened before, pretty much at all in our history of any nation. And I know there have been those that have pulled out, but not at this stage. Not as intrinsically, within Europe as we've been. So the full extent of what happens if we pull out is really almost anybody's guess. And I think Nick's right in what he's saying. But the potential for economic impact is huge, and for the event industry, absolutely. We rely a lot on the freedom of travel. We rely a lot on, and I have actually spoken to some American friends, and they get a sense over there that they enjoy coming to Britain. We are quoting 2 tours around London by incoming US clients, and I had another inquiry this morning, and I fear that will stop if they're not allowed the freedom of access to UK, and then as a springboard the rest of Europe as part of a motivational incoming tour, conference, seminar, or whatever.
And that's fundamentally what they want to do, is it? When you're working with clients from North America, they want to come into the UK, but they now know that logistically that they've got excellent transport links either by road or rail or air into Europe, and they can use that as a springboard coming in, and there is a possibility that will stop. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I think they'll certainly give it consideration, and I think the worrying thing with I can only quote these conversations with a few contacts in the US, but I think my fear certainly is that they will not necessarily see reality. If we do come out, that will be it to them. UK is no longer a springboard to Europe, even if it is, and even if it remains so until any changes seriously bite. I just think they will have an instant reaction. I think as we all do, public opinion is often swayed more instantly than it should be.
The simple geography is something that I think we forget sometimes when it comes to dealing with our sort of colleagues over in North America, in that that they will travel across 2 or 3 states to get to somewhere, and that's the equivalent of us travelling halfway across Europe, and they just don't understand that there is potentially this scenario where you can't travel on a 7-hour car journey without being stopped 3 or 4 times and have your passport checked or require a visa to move, a couple of hours down the road. I think there's this genuine sort of not a non-understanding, but just from a geography point of view, because of the size of their territory, that you may not be able to move as freely as possible. And I think certainly from the conversations I've had with people earlier on this year when I was over in the States, is they don't quite understand just sort of why we just can't move anywhere, because it's such a small area in relation to what they're used to dealing with. Nick, I don't know how many clients in the past, or how many people you've worked with in the past from North America who what's their understanding like in your sort of experience of how things work over in Europe?
Well, I mean, I've got some scatty examples of being over there with talking to young people who said, "Is Paris in London?" was one of the quotes. But I digress. But I don't have enough practical experience really to say anything about that. But I do think it's an interesting kind of parallel where people keep saying the United States would never accept that, which from the Brexit side, they look at it and say, well, the United States would never do that. And by its very nature, that sentence doesn't make sense to me, because it's a collection of states under one broad umbrella, which seems to be an absolute sort of statement, rather than this kind of, well, you wouldn't do that if Canada said something to you, which is outside there anyway. So I don't know what the parallel is geographically, but to me that's a model of a union of states, which is exactly what it is, and that's how it can work. You've still got independent, border control. Effectively, you've still got independent thinking states who can make their own decisions on the things that they like. Or feel important about, and so I mean, it's a twisted way of looking at it, I think, and it's a bad example for Brexit once again in terms of of what works and what doesn't work, and what we should aspire to.
I mean,
Robin,
sorry, just jump in quickly. Another example that came up this morning. One of our team, one of our directors, Paul's just come back from an incentive group trip to Peru. I've been out there for just over a week, and we were sort of chatting just as an idea. What happens, for instance, if we are not able to so easily travel to, say, Amsterdam? Amsterdam is a great hub for worldwide travel, as is Heathrow. And if we've got some guests that can't make a particular Heathrow flight or whatever, and you're looking at Amsterdam as a real option,
of course,
we get them across there quite quickly, or whatever it might be. Is that going to not be so readily available to us? Is it going to have that much of an effect?
Well, of course, yes, because we have to look at it from I think a lot when we talk about logistics and travelling around Europe. I think instantly we think about just sort of driving, because it is so easy to move around Europe on the road in the grand scheme of things. But we shouldn't forget that there are these hubs like Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and of course Frankfurt, which is another huge hub, isn't it, for global air travel that could be affected. I'm curious to know, Robin, going back to start the conversation, and again, without dwelling on it as we've done before, about your extensive history within the industry so far, but looking back to how it was travelling around Europe when you first started dealing with continental Europe and working over there, how different was it to the way that you're able to operate today? Have things slowly progressed, or was there a point that you can remember where suddenly it just all became that little bit easier to deal with?
No, I think it's been a progression, for sure, and I won't bore you with some of my tales of history and even some horrifying tales, but I can remember being stuck in somewhere between Leipzig and wherever it was in Western Germany, as it was then. Again, border controls, had a whole load of stuff that we were working on with an electronics and technical inspection equipment company, and a whole great long list of technical kit that the border control guys wanted to go through. And we got stuck, for I think two nights, 2 days in what was basically no man's land between the east and the west. That was pretty horrifying, I have to say. And of course, none of that exists at all now, unless you go much further afield.
Absolutely, yeah. A lot easier to simply move it across, isn't it? Not that there aren't any of these checks. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you both is that my opinion is that we're often, in the UK event industry, leaders and pioneers in the way that the wider event industry around the world is driven and run, often with the instigators of new processes, of new hardware, of new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. Would you agree with the opinion that I hold, that we do prompt a lot of improvement in the wider industry, and that perhaps could be affected should we leave, is that people may not acknowledge our own industry as freely and as openly as they do now?
Nick?
I think there's a core of things that you're very, very good at, and that's only in fairness that just disappears, or people's knowledge or assumption just disappears because of a legislative change. I think what you're good at remains what you're good at, and I think what you can change anything, but you're still going to be respected and doing that. Whether you are still cost efficient in doing that is another argument altogether.
Sure.
And I think that's probably the key difference in that. I think if you just have to look at the successes in events we've had in this country and the kind of level we've taken them to, and the respect they've got around the world. You're not going to suddenly think they're no good at that because they're out of Europe or out of the EU. But it will become harder to compete, and there's examples of European companies coming into and taking on gigs in this country, events of any shape or form, and then a fluctuation in the euro can suddenly mean they're not competitive. And I know that for a fact for things I used to write about. And so if you change that and you're suddenly, and the pound, which is going to, sink off, like a stone anyway, if Brexit happens, it's all of the financial impact that you get naturally. I think whatever, however good or bad a decision may be, that you do get that huge economic impact straight away. Well, the markets and everyone just scratch their heads and work out where the money lies, and you do make small or big event businesses' life a lot more difficult. So I think that anyone in this industry who's really looked at it wouldn't be holding their hands up to suffer sort of really big financial hardship over the short and potentially medium term.
Sure. Robin, I just want to play devil's advocate for a second here. You do a lot of work in Europe, it's fair to say. And presumably the reason that you do a lot of work in Europe is because the clients that you're working for value the work that you do. They want to work with you. So surely even if we vote out, people are going to do their utmost to ensure that they can continue working with the companies that they've always worked with. Surely we're all worried, or are we all worried in a sense that suddenly the borders are going to go up and these walls are going to be built? But in actual fact, there is an argument to suggest that even if we vote out, there will be quite a lot of work done to ensure that UK businesses can continue delivering the services that European clients value.
Yeah, that may be the case, but I'm also a great believer in young people, and I think we have some amazing talent in the UK. I think that's been more than borne out by our development in the event industry. As you both say, we lead in many respects in this particular industry, and that has to come from a mixture of experience and obviously youth and a very dynamic approach to what we all do. And I just fear that, not short term by any means, I don't think we'll see barriers thrown up in any sense, emotionally, legally or otherwise, quite quickly. But I think in the long term, I do worry what my granddaughter, if she comes into our industry, what it will be like for her in years to come. And I do think that we have to have as open a view of competition, and as Nick said, cost is very much part of this, and I think we will see increasing costs and increasingly difficult ways of having to compete, regardless.
It's it's a subject that will roll on until the 23rd of June. I've no doubt at all. We've put a call out on the Talking Events Twitter account this morning, asking for anybody who is firmly in the out camp and why they think that potentially could benefit the industry, could benefit the UK, but certainly keeping it on topic. We want to hear from anybody out there who thinks that as an industry we could potentially benefit from being out. It would be interesting. We've heard two, not necessarily arguments today, but certainly two opinions and two trains of thought that suggest as an industry we're far better off staying in. So get in touch with us at Talking Events. If you've got an opinion on it, we'll get you on the show and hear what you've got to say. For the time being, we're going to wrap up this particular episode. Nick Howden, thanks for joining us again. Thanks for stepping in and giving us your opinions.
No, not a problem at all. Good to speak to you, Robin, as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. Must catch up sometime.
Yeah, definitely.
Robin Carlisle, Mobile Promotions. Thanks again for joining us. We do appreciate it.
Pleasure, anytime. Thank you.
You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Talking Events. Watch episodes of the podcast via eventindustrynews.co.uk and subscribe to the podcast via iTunes. But for now, my name is James Dixon. You've been listening to Talking Events.